It is hard to believe, but this is actually our 26th lesson in the in the Sermon on the Mount. And so we've really looked in depth as far as chapter 5 is concerned. And we will begin with chapter 6 this day and this particular lesson. And actually, it's our 27th if you count the time that I read the Sermon on the Mount. But as we continue our examination of the Sermon on the Mount, we will begin with an overview of chapter 5. Now, in that overview, Jesus began with the Beatitudes, which is a description of the true disciples of the Lord, and that's verses 3 through 12. Then Jesus made an application of that description of the Beatitudes, ye are the light of the world, or ye are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Next, Jesus taught a superior righteousness to that of the scribes and the Pharisees, and all disciples should manifest that characteristics, or the characteristics of a superior righteousness. Now, really it's a continuation of that thought. We have the true righteousness that Jesus exhorted his disciples to live by, and that is portrayed in 5 contrasts. The first is, thou shalt not kill. And Jesus said, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill. But I say unto you that you love, or that you do not hate your brother without a cause. And then also, thou shalt not commit adultery. And Jesus said, don't look on a woman to lust after her. And then, thou shalt not forswear thyself. And Jesus said, swear not at all. And then he said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus said that you resist not evil. And finally, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. And that's the last one, but Jesus said that you should love your enemies and pray for them that curse you. But we're really concerned with the 6th chapter and the beginning of the 6th chapter. Now, with that in mind, this is really about the true disciples' relationship to God, the Father. And we understand this by the number of times Jesus addressed something about the Father or about God. There are 34 verses in this chapter. And Jesus used the term Father or the term God 15 different times. That's one in every other verse, nearly. And so it's clearly a reference to the relationship that we have with the Father. Now, he used the term Father in the first 18 verses, which is what we're going to introduce actually tonight. He used that term Father 10 different times in the first 18 verses. Now, that's more than one every other verse. So Jesus is very clearly concerned with our relationship to the Father. And he desires us to have a good relationship with him. Now, chapter 6 portrays then a picture of the disciples' relationship with God as he journeys through the pilgrimages of life. Now, there are 2 main sections in the 6th chapter. You have verses 1 through 18, which is the true disciples' religious life, and is manifested in 3 different ways, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. So Jesus taught us how to have, or how to be that true disciple, and how to have the right type of a religious life. Now in verses 19 to 34, the remainder of the chapter, he taught the true disciples about his general life, that is, his life as a whole. And that would include such things as the disciples' needs for food and for water or for drink, and also for clothing, and really in application at least in other cares that we have. Now sometimes we find ourselves misery and unhappy, losing out on joy and the rejoicing that should come as being in Christ. And it's probably because of some neglect of some aspect in life. People find themselves going in the wrong direction. especially in their spiritual life, and they miss out on that joy. Temptations concerning the profane, the carnal, the physical part of man. Well, it gets all mixed up, and the priorities gets mixed up. And so we ask then, well, why? Could it be our relationship with God is the reason why we miss out on those good things of life? Well, in chapter 6 and verse 1, we have then the thesis stated. Now, Jesus stated his thesis in verse 1, which is, and we'll look at in more detail as we go through this lesson, but he said, "Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise, ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven." Then he illustrated that thesis in three ways. The first is with almsgiving. That's verses 2 through 4. Then the second way is through prayer, verses 5 through 15. And then the third way is through fasting, verses 16 through 18. Now, these illustrations cover three areas of man's religious life. Almsgiving is about what good things that we do. And the little kids with the little stickers that I pass out, I said, be a helping hand. Well, that's what is meant by almsgiving, and that's really why the sticker was given, so that we can be good helping hands, and we ought to be. Well, that's what almsgiving is about. Isn't that our service to God, at least in part? Well, yeah. We really, as we look at the life of a Christian, it can be divided into two basic parts. You have the service that we provide to other people and the good works that we provide. That's that almsgiving, but it also is divided by the idea of worship and those 5 areas of worship that we give. Now, the next thing he said is prayer. And that prayer really concerns our communion with God. Now, I believe that Jesus in this particular passage is talking about actually our prayer to the Father, the request that we make and the adoration that we give in our request to our Father. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that that's what he's talking about. However, think about it this way also. Because when you look at the word prayer, prayer is oftentimes used as a figure of speech. The technical name is a synecdoche, where a part represents the whole. And prayer oftentimes represents worship. Could it be that not only was Jesus really addressing the idea of our prayer life, but he was actually addressing the idea of our worship life? I think there's a good possibility there. And so we have to really concern ourselves with our communion with God. How are we communing with God? That's a part of our life. And then fasting has reference to the mortification of sin, the mortification of the flesh, and putting the flesh in second place as it ought to be. Now our purpose is really to examine in this particular lesson, to examine chapter 6 and verse 1, in which we titled as our thesis. There he says, "Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise, ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven." Now, there's several things I want to note about this particular verse before we look at some points taken from it. The first is take heed. Take heed, well, means hold your mind toward this. Now, I think about it this way, and I don't know, maybe it's kind of a funny way of looking at it, but have you ever been out of focus and you have to zero your mind back in? And the way that this particular definition was given, it's like taking a hold of your head and moving it to the right direction so that you're going the right way. Well, we don't physically take a hold of our head like that, but you can get the picture. And it really helps us to understand that we need to be focused on the right things. So take heed. You be focused. Hold your mind toward. And it carries the idea of constantly guarding yourself against doing your alms to be seen of men. Now that's really what this verse is about. You be on guard that you do not your alms, your good deeds, before men to be seen of them. Now we'll go into more detail about that thought, but that's what we need to be on guard for. Now, another thought concerning this particular verse is alms, the word actually means mercies or kindness. And I think kindness would have been a better way of translating it. Although, I think most of us know what almsgiving is. And it is used in other times within this passage. But I found it interesting that some of the manuscripts some of the other manuscripts that we have actually has the word righteousness here. And I believe that's really and maybe it's a interpretation of this particular passage to help us to understand what the meaning is. And I think maybe that's why it was translated that particular way. Take heed that you do not your righteousness before men to be seen of them. Now that's our almsgiving. And he illustrated that righteousness then in those three ways. In our benevolence, that is our almsgiving, in our prayer life, and in our fasting. And so Jesus is concerned then with the things that we do in this life. He's concerned with our deeds. But he's also concerned about the motivation of our deeds. You see, this is really not about the deeds themselves as much as it is about the motivation of why we do those things. Do we do it to be seen of men? Now, I've worked in actually several preaching schools for several years. And having worked in several preaching schools and seen students come and students go, and there's always some that clearly preach to be seen of men. Always there are those that do those things to be seen of men. Now, if it is true with preachers, you think it's also true with members? Yeah, that's where preachers come from. There's always those within the brotherhood, within any congregation, who do those things to be seen of men. Jesus is concerned not only about the things that we do, but that we do it for the right motivation. It's not to be seen of men, and if it is done to be seen of men, there's no reward of the Father. Now, with this thesis briefly explained and stated, then let's consider three principles that we learn from the thesis. The first is, to live righteously, a person must have balance. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the balance that I'm talking about is in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16. He said, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." Yet our thesis says, "Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven." Now, is this a contradiction? I mean, he says, you let your light so shine, but now you say that you're not to do it before men. Are disciples to give alms? Are the disciples to pray? Are disciples to fast only in secret and only not to be seen of men? Well, if strictly spoken of in that way, if strictly in secret, then I have to ask myself, how can I let my light shine? Well, disciples should live in such a way to cause others to glorify God. At the same time, disciples must realize their righteousness is not to attract attention to self. You see, Jesus is concerned with motives. Now, considering this, some swing to the left and others swing to the right. Well, isn't that the way people do? Almost in any topic that you want to talk about that's maybe a little bit controversial, some will swing one way, others will swing the other. And so some will swing to the left by withdrawing themselves like a hermit or like a monk, not wanting to be seen of men. Well, is that what we're to do? I don't think so. Others want to turn to the right, and by being flamboyant and showy, justifying themselves by saying, I'm the salt of the earth and I'm the light of the world. Well, true disciples maintain a balance between those two ideas by not giving into either extreme. They are not motivated by self-interests. They do not desire to attract attention to themselves. Their desire is to glorify God. But at the same time, they do not hide their talents in a closet. Now, I think there's a good example of this in the Old Testament. And it really fits well here, especially when we get over to the idea of prayer. You remember Daniel? Well, most everybody remembers Daniel, the good man that Daniel was. And you remember what his practice was as far as praying? He would pray toward Jerusalem every night, and he'd pray in his window. But did he pray in his window so that everybody in the town could see him? Or did he pray in his window because he was mourning over the loss of being separated from the city of Jerusalem? In his mind, separated from Judaism. But did he stop when he was commanded to stop? No. But he still didn't do it to be seen of men. He did it because it was the right thing to do. So we do those things, and we let our light shine, and we have that influence. But brethren, we're not having that influence to point to what good things we have done. No, we have that influence to glorify God. We must maintain that balance, and we can't ever allow ourselves to be out of balance with reference to those things. We must always check ourselves. The second point that we want to draw out from our text is to live righteously, a person must choose. Now, let's go back to our text, and our text is, and this is really pointed out in the text, he said, take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise, ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Now, the choice that we're talking about here in this particular point is we have to choose between pleasing men or pleasing God. Which is it? What are we doing? The idea of pleasing men also would include self. Think about that for a second. Are we not a part of mankind? And if we're doing it to please ourselves, are we not pleasing men? It's a little bit like, with marriage, we sometimes will say, and actually a reference to what Jesus said, let not man put asunder. You ever heard that expression? I've used it numerous times in weddings and different times that I've had that privilege to do for a couple. And I've said it numerous times, let not man put asunder. But in every wedding that I've ever done, I require a premarital counseling session. And I talk about that very thing because that has reference to, or at least it includes, the couple themselves. Let not man put asunder. Would that not include the husband? Let not man put asunder. Would that not include the wife? Now, oftentimes they'll blame it on their in-laws, whatever it might be, or they'll blame it on money, or they'll blame it on other things, but it still all ultimately comes to self. and our desire. And so it is when we're talking about pleasing men. Are we doing it to please ourselves? Well, in some sense, if we please men, are we not trying to please men in order to please self? People want others to think better of them. So we set out to please them, but in reality, the real motive is self-gratification, self-pleasing. Now notice some passages that speak on this subject. And I've included these, or some of them, on the PowerPoint. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, Paul said, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ." Now remember, Galatia is that area basically would be the eastern part of Asia Minor. And that would include probably Antioch of Pisidia, as well as Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium, the churches that were there, and the difficulties that those churches were having. And in fact, Paul talked about that throughout this particular epistle. But then he also had to defend his own apostleship. And yet he was the one that helped plant the church there in those cities and in that particular area. He was the one that separated his life from the other things that he was doing before he became a Christian, or even after he became a Christian, in order to go on those mission trips to preach the gospel. And yet they were questioning them on that. Well, I think about different ones in Ukraine, the different things that different ones would say. And I finally told one fellow one time, that Ukraine is not a place you go on vacation. It's not a place you desire to go. And I'm not here to go on vacation. And very clearly, that was the case, because I was working all the time and not really having anything to do with other things. Well, are we have to ask, seeking to please men or seeking to please Christ? In James 4 and verse 4, James wrote, "Ye adulterers and adulteresses," and clearly that's a reference to spiritual adulterers and adulteresses. And that terminology actually used several times in the Old Testament, but I always think about the book of Hosea. And that terminology is actually used because that's showing the affection that we ought to be showing to God, and we're moving it and showing it to another. And that's what those to whom James wrote about, that's what they were doing. They were no longer showing affection to God like they should have been doing, but they were showing affection to the world. And so he said, "Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God." In John, the 12th chapter, in verse 42, Jesus said, "Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue." Well, and this actually fits the context of our passage. You remember in the previous chapter and in the previous line of reasoning, Jesus said, "For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Could it be that his previous discussion led to this particular point? Who are we trying to please, God or man? If we want to be like the Pharisees, then we're going to be pleasing self. But if we're not going to be like the Pharisees and have a superior righteousness to the Pharisees, we will please God. Later on in the sermon, in fact, later on in this particular chapter, Jesus said, "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one, despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. By doing God's will, Jesus sought only the praise of God. And we find a number of passages, most of which are found in the book of John, that really declare that. And I'm only going to give a sampling from John, but we're going to give a couple other ones besides that. In John chapter 5 and verse 30, there it says, Jesus said, I can of my own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. Now give it some thought concerning this particular passage. If Jesus set aside his own will, in other words, pleasing men, in order to please the Father, I mean, we're talking about the Son of God. If he did it, should we not? Obviously so. In John the 6th chapter, in verse 38, Jesus said, For I came down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him that sent me. And so it wasn't to do his own will. It was to do the Father's will. And in John 14, verse 10, Jesus reminded the disciples, Believest thou not that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwelleth in me. He doeth the works. And then in Matthew, the 26th chapter, in verse 39, in this particular passage, this is before Jesus goes, well, this is when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane before he goes to the cross. And he said, there the text says, and he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. Can you feel the words of Jesus in this passage? Thinking about his own death, thinking about the crucifixion, think about him being suspended between heaven and earth upon that cross. From his human side, he didn't want to go through that. But thankfully, because of his love, he was willing to do the Father's will. And in John 8 and verse 29, He that sent me is with me. The Father hath not left me alone, for I do always those things that please him. And so it's very clear, Jesus' point in this particular passage. And we have to be very careful about these things. Now let's make some application to ourselves. To help us to make that application and to apply the principle, then we have a penetrating and soul-searching question that Jesus asked. How can ye believe which receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that cometh from God only? Now, to help us to motivate ourselves to live for God, we must always remember that we are in the presence of God. Well, you remember back over in Genesis that Hagar, she left and fled from Sarah. Now, Sarah had sent Abraham to Hagar, and she was trying to really circumvent the promise of God. And so she thought that if Abraham would have seed through Hagar, that Abraham would have the seed that was promised to him. And so she circumvented that. Well, you could just imagine now, after all that was said and done, and Hagar gave birth to a child, and Sarah was still barren, that Sarah became jealous and she sent her away. And in Genesis chapter 16 and verse 13, Hagar, she didn't know where to go. She was frustrated and she stopped. But an angel appeared to her. And you know what the angel said? Well, in Genesis 16 and verse 13, and she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her. Now that's Abraham's influence. That's Sarah's influence on Hagar. She spoke to the Lord. And she said, she called on the name of the Lord and spake unto her, Thou God seest me. And she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? In other words, the angel had to remind Hagar that God saw her and he would take care of her, and he did. Now, also another example of this, the Pharisees who actually this is found in Luke, the 16th chapter in verse 15, but in verse 14, there it says that the Pharisees were covetous. And Jesus said to them, Ye are they which justify yourselves before men. But here's the point we're making. Remember, we're talking about being in the presence of God. But God knoweth your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. God knows who we are. He knows everything about us. He sees us each moment, and we cannot escape from him. And to the world and people of the world, they think that, oh no, this all-seeing eye can see us all the time, and we cannot escape from it. But to those that seek a relationship with the Father, aren't we thankful that Jesus promised, And lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the world. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 13, Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do. And so it is the case that God is always there, and we're in the presence of God. And if we remember that we're always in God's presence and we cannot escape from him, and if we are seeking to do the will of God, it will revolutionize our lives. Self-adulation will disappear. Hypocrisy will vanish. And there would be a revival that's never seen in the past and probably will never be seen in the future that would take place if we just remember always that we're in the presence of God. Every disciple would live holy lives every day, every moment. Trouble would immediately cease in congregations of God's people, and the church would grow by leaps and bounds, because we know that we are in the presence of God and we must do his will. To live righteously, a person must seek the right reward. Again, we turn back to our thesis, which says, Take heed that you do not your alms before men, to be seen of them, otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Now, clearly, the right reward is the just recompense of reward. And what we mean by that is that whatever reward we get in the end, it's going to be a righteous and just reward. Doesn't make any difference. Now, we might think it's unfair, and as far as men's judgments are concerned, it is the case that sometimes men are unjustly judged. I mean, you can think about different people that you've known in the news and famous people, and somehow they escape the judgment that should come upon them. And they've lived wicked lives, and somehow the world sees them as good people, But they're not good people. They're not moral people. And in fact, some of them are even murderers. But God's judgment is not going to be that way. It is always going to be a just recompense of reward. And this is emphasized clearly within Scripture. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, but without faith it is impossible to please him, for he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Concerning Moses, in chapter 11 and verse 26, again in the book of Hebrews, it says, he esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Now, think about Moses' life. Now, Moses' life is divided into 3 periods, but we're talking about the first period, and that's what this verse is talking about. And it's basically the first 40 years of his life. And he was raised up in Pharaoh's household, and he was second only to Pharaoh himself. Now, you know what that would mean? That all the riches of Pharaoh, all the riches that a Pharaoh would possess, and all the riches of a political leader, he would have all of that. Every bit of it. All the pleasures that would be associated with that. That's what he had. But he gave it all up because of the recompense of reward. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, whether it be good or bad, according to that he hath done, whether it be good and bad. Now here's our point. There is no reward from God for those who seek the rewards of men. Now people can talk about these passages, and this is repeated with every single one of these things. It's stated in the thesis in verse 1, but it's stated again in verse 2 with reference to almsgiving. It's stated in verse 5 with reference to prayer, and it's stated in verse 16 with reference to fasting. If you're doing it to be seen of men, you already have your reward. And people will say, well, is he talking about heaven or is it talking about earth? Well, read the verse. If you're seeking the rewards of men, that's what you're going to get. It's not difficult to understand. The rewards of men and seeking the rewards of men is a pretty temporal reward. I think I'd rather seek the rewards from God. No matter what good work I might be involved in, doesn't make any difference. And how great that work might be, whether it's evangelism, whether it's edification, whether it's going out into the world to preach the gospel, whether it's helping others by the various things and various ways that we do it. Whatever work that I'm involved in, if it is done to be seen of men, Jesus said, I get nothing other than the reward from men. I get nothing. No wonder Paul had talked about it like a clanging cymbal. 1 Corinthians 13. This would apply to almsgiving, helping others, giving money, investing time. This would apply to our prayer life, whether public or private. This would apply to our fasting, that mortification of sin. We must be extremely careful and examine our motivation. Jesus set forth this thesis. And this thesis is for the first 18 verses. And we talked about that already. Take heed that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise, ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Now it's time to look in a mirror. And we must look in that mirror. And Brother Bill did a good job in explaining what we're talking about here. Why are we doing works of righteousness? Now, while we look in that mirror and we're asking this question, will we just turn away, or will we go away without really even looking at self, examining self? In my mind, one of the most difficult things to do is to examine self. Oh, it's easy to say, oh, that person does this and that person does that and this person over here, they do those kind of things. That's easy to do. And everybody's guilty of that. And everybody can see the faults of everybody else. But Jesus talked about that very thing. That's what he was talking about when he says, judge not that you be not judged. You have a mote in your eye, and here you're trying to take a splinter out of somebody else's eye. You see, we need to do some self-examination before we do examination of everybody else. And having been a member of the church for a number of years, I've seen it constantly within the church. We can find out everybody else's fault, but we never take the time to look in the mirror and examine ourselves. What do we see in that mirror concerning motivation? Why are we doing works of righteousness? Is our motivation to bring glory to self, or is it to bring glory to God? Now that's the essence of this sermon. And that's what we're striving to help us to examine. If you're subject to the invitation, you have the question before you, you have examined yourself. Do you need to respond to the invitation? Only you can answer that question. If you need to respond, the invitation is yours as together we stand and sing to encourage you.